I have some discussion questions that I'd like to put out to you. Before I do that, we have a couple minutes. If anyone has any burning questions right now for myself or Jeb, we're happy to take them. It's also really important that we hear from you today, so if you've got a question that you want to ask right now, we're happy to answer and also to have conversation throughout the course of the day. I don't see any. Oh, yes, please.
I don't think I need to press one.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Otherwise,
Please do, yeah.
Okay. Does everybody hear me okay?
Thank you.
So I'd like to understand two questions. One would be the criteria that was used to establish the framework for resiliency and the definition attributed to that, and how that reflects or is balanced by notions of sustainability and how the two interlink.
Do you want to take that,
Take a
Jeb?
stab at that. Yeah, I think I come from a sustainability practice background, having founded ECLA, Local Governments for Sustainability, in 1990. And there's been a lot of discussion among the community of sustainability practitioners about precisely what resilience brings to the table. Arup, that developed the City Resilience Framework, obviously also very much anchored in sustainability practice as an engineering and design firm. So what they basically are trying to, I think what it does is it leverages off of sustainability, of course, starting as a kind of resource efficiency, green sustainability point of view, evolves over time into understanding that it's really about socioeconomic equity and justice, as well as those things and the distribution of resources between people. I think where they ended up is saying those benefits that we seek to pursue through a sustainability strategy, how do we ensure that we pursue them in a way that they are risk managed, and that when we make an investment to deal with a risk or a stress within our city, we do it in a way that advances as many of those objectives as possible. So I think I'm saying that clearly, but the resilience, one could say resilience is about sustainability plus in that it both reinforces our ability to be successful with sustainability objectives that we have for our cities, but it does it so in such a way that allows us to use our resources more effectively and results in this underlying different condition than sustainability as a kind of long-term objective. And again, I assume a sustainability practitioner yourself, the practitioners came to, it's not an end, it's a process. It's something we constantly do. And what we're trying, I think where resilience adds value is to say it creates an underlying condition in which we can continue to pursue that ambition and know that we can be on track and be aware of the shock, stresses, scenarios that might disrupt us from where we want to be. Let me just give one example since I think we do have a little time. I've worked since 1991 with Miami-Dade County in southern Florida on climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation and freshwater supply protection and all kinds of sustainability, traditionally sustainability related issues. They have not been effective, even with climate adaptation planning, in being able to link it with an agenda on how they're going to protect the assets and the populations of the city from a Hurricane Irma. And so where I think if one wants to look at this as a sustainability practitioner, what this brings to the table is the opportunity, and Katie, I think, emphasized it very well, to put that kind of risk management overlay over those ambitions that a place like Miami-Dade County has tried to be successful with for 30 years, but actually hasn't been able to lift up. And one of the examples of that is they've been trying to float a bond issue for about 10 years now to put on the ballot for major seawall infrastructure or coastal protection, not just hard walls, but also dunes and things like that. They've never been able to move that financing agenda together because of this disconnect between the risk management part of the city and how we don't actually invest in terms of our longer term risk exposures, connecting that with their current day sustainability objectives. So they're very compatible, but I would argue that resilience very much fills a gap that we we didn't attend to sufficiently as sustainability practitioners. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but I think it's a key question.
Ellen?
Thank you. I was part of a discussion here a few years ago that the Japan Foundation put on, and one of the things that came up at that conference was that after the tsunami in Fukushima, that women were found dead in their homes because they were doing the unpaid work of childcare and elder care. And my second example was, given that women make 80% of the household decisions, which obviously have to do a lot with sustainability, I'm curious that you don't have an intersectional lens on the work, either ICLEI's work or the work you're talking about with the city, or a gendered intersectional lens, in order to really have the people at the table who understand the problems in the neighborhoods and can come up with solutions that will really work.
Sure, yeah. So that's a really good and important point, and I would acknowledge and agree that my own experience has been that women in particular are more impacted by crisis around the world, and also in many cases here in Vancouver. And I think that, we didn't get to dig too deeply into the lenses that we will be looking at. I think that the City Resilience Framework, and you'll get to look at it a little bit more deeply this afternoon, also provides an opportunity to integrate gendered a gender and an intersectional lens. But this is also the space where we need to make those recommendations as we're at the outset of the strategy and figure out what is the best way to do that. So thank you for that comment. That's exactly what we're looking for, and it's important.
Over at the back?
I'll just add that the gender equity issue is very much built in to the framework itself. Of course, there are many issues that need to be addressed, but it's in particular coming out in what the cities are doing in their strategies. So to me, that's the best indicator that the framework itself is guiding people into a conversation in which fundamental equity issues such as gender equity are getting addressed. There are still ways in which cities, particularly given that this is a process driven through the public sector, through the municipality oftentimes, are avoiding the 800-pound gorillas. In some of our developing country cities, for instance, where the informal city is more than half of the population of the city, more than half of the economic production of the city is in the informal sector, and wage inequities, poverty wage is the norm for the majority of the population. Land tenure isn't there. I think we are using the framework to drive those conversations to the extent that we can with governmental officials. For instance, in Africa, we have a partnership with Slum Dwellers International and Cities Alliance, and making sure those people are at the table, bringing data and awareness into a process. But at the end of the day, we're still sort of trying to manage the way municipal government understands things like inequity and informality. But it's very front and center in what we're trying to get at here.
And we'll be discussing it in the breakout groups under the City for All topic. So can we go to another question here, then over here, and then back there?
I have a question for Katie. Just curious to hear a bit more what the relationship is between the city's climate adaptation plan and the resilience strategy.
Yeah, good question. So over the last few years, maybe I'm just going to back up a little bit, because in my previous role in the Office of Emergency Management, we were starting to have this conversation more and more with our sustainability group, who's leading the climate adaptation strategy, around how do we really come together and work together so that we have a sort of a consistent narrative around risk and resilience. And more recently, the conversations that I've been having with the team that's leading the climate adaptation strategy really have focused on the opportunity to apply and address our social challenges within the context of the climate adaptation strategy, and acknowledging some of the disconnects that have existed in the past between social and climate challenges. And we really see that resilience provides us with an opportunity, almost a gut check, to understand what are the implications across multiple sectors, multiple dimensions of that framework, of the climate adaptation work that we're moving forward, but also how can we ensure that the work that we are doing is actually addressing the needs of the people who will be most impacted in the context of climate adaptation. So as an example, it's really exciting to see that our sustainability group is launching a new initiative to understand the potential risk of heat on seniors. And that's an initiative, I think, in collaboration with Evergreen, and that's work that we'll also be contributing to. But I think that there's a lot more of that discussion that needs to happen, and those are also places, questions that we can put to our partners in 100 Resilient Cities to see how they're tackling that, and come back to this group to further refine that dialogue.
Over there? You're on.
Add something to that point. The problem with climate adaptation, let me put it this way, it's kind of like another risk management silo that we're creating. And I say that as a sort of ICLEI guy who started working with cities on climate adaptation in the 1990s, climate adaptation planning. Just like we've dealt with brownfields development sites and the set of risks that get managed around that, and we've created a set of regulations and policies and frameworks for managing hazardous sites and soils. We've kind of approached climate adaptation in the same way, with the assumption that if we can identify the cost of the potential losses in the future, we will invest and allocate our money differently to mitigate those costs. And I think that's a false assumption, and Katie highlights it herself, that we don't seem to allocate capital to these incredible, expensive trillion-dollar exposures that our cities are, sit with day after day, and over the period of decades, we see them coming at us, but we don't allocate capital to them until Superstorm Sandy strikes. And the New York City Adaptation Plan is a case in point in that, which is why I gave that example. So what resilience does different, and it says, how can we manage those things, our climate exposures, in such a way that it generates such robust performance and value for us today that there's an investment case for doing it today, and that there's a political and civic movement for doing it today, and not waiting for maybe 10 years when the climate risk might get to a point where it's going to lead to catastrophic losses. So it's very much in support of the climate adaptation agenda, but it sort of flips the incentives around it, rather than saying, if we pose people with a big enough potential loss, they will act and change the way they allocate their resources and the way they prioritize things in policies, rather than saying, if we can do something today that will mitigate that risk, that people get benefits from today, that's when people will do it. And that this magic word we call the resilience dividend, or resilience value, is all about understanding how we can do that in all of these exposures and risks that get identified in the process.
This is a question comment for Jeb. I'm not entirely certain whether the U.S. context is completely interchangeable with the Canadian context. You mentioned the subprime crisis. We did take a hit, but our banks are regulated, so it wasn't as severe. The notion of foundations and financing are fundamentally different, including the tax system between Canada and the U.S. Virtually no funding is available for NGOs in Canada from foundations. And I'm just wondering, for instance, the 60% growth of housing over the formation of households in the U.S. Compared to Canada, that would have been a really interesting statistic. And the notion around pent-up demand, for instance, boomerang kids who can't afford, may be undefined as pent-up demand. So I'm wondering if it's possible to have Canadian stats and examples, and with the U.S. examples, the elements that are readily transferable as teaching tools.
Yeah, and I only gave that example to sort of highlight how underlying stresses are fundamental contributors to the crisis itself. So a real estate bubble, which is something that you're experiencing here in Vancouver, and I'm a Torontonian, and Canadian as well, that we experience in Toronto. And when you regulate your market here, the money flows straight to Toronto. We saw that with a 20% increase in prices in the period of just a few months last year in our housing market in downtown Toronto, central Toronto. So we have the dynamics of a bubble and a potential oversupply. I wouldn't say that here, but let me speak to Toronto. But the financing end of it is regulated. So it's not transferable. But my point was that we get shocked sometimes by how something that happens in the economic world or in the national policy world interacts with what the stresses we've not been able to manage locally within our sprawling urban regions to create a crisis that's way beyond what anyone conceived was possible. So it's just to exemplify how those things creep up on us. I would say, and I can speak as a Torontonian, I can't speak as a Canadian because I think your housing situation is quite different than Toronto. But Toronto, where more than 50% of householders are first-generation immigrants to the city who are just focusing on establishing basic elements of livelihood possibility. They can't practice their professions because the colleges in Ontario regulate out nurses from being a nurse in Canada unless they go back to school and become a nurse again. We have taxi drivers who are engineers, physicists, who can't practice because of the way we regulate labor markets within Ontario, for instance. So we have this huge majority population in the city faced with rising housing affordability issues, with access to employment issues. And so I would give it, I don't have the data today, it's not the example I brought forward, but it's an example of the same thing, that there are these chronic stresses that are building up, and we don't know what will trigger that in terms of there being, Toronto, well, Rob Ford, you could say a political crisis with a kind of populism that took everyone by surprise. That is part of what did happen. But it could have all kinds of other things. What happens if the next time a SARS-type pandemic hits our shores here in Canada, and you've got those underlying stresses where you don't even know how many people are living in a Thorncliffe Park, in a high-rise rental apartment, low-income rental apartment building? How do we manage public health in that context? So my main point was not so much to say there's a parallel between what happened in the States and what happened here, is that the dynamic of underlying stresses interacting with some shock event can lead to things that have consequences way beyond any scenario planning has ever identified. And therefore, in the resiliency process, we put equal emphasis on knowing what those underlying stresses are and how we address the stresses, in addition to addressing whatever catastrophic exposures we can measure and already know are there. Hope that it doesn't really answer your question, and I'm not giving a data-driven example, but I'll be happy to come up with one.
You've done enough.
By the next time we talk. Bye.
Okay, let's move over here.
Hi, there are lots of existing frameworks like STAR Community Index, the Eco-Districts framework, as well as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And a lot of these frameworks address many of the elements of a resilience framework. And I'm just wondering how these frameworks have informed the resilience framework, as well as, how does the resilience framework build on those, so that we're not reinventing the wheel or creating this resilience thing as the new sexy topic that replaces sustainability.
Yep. So the tools that we developed in the City Resilience Framework is just this entry point into an exploratory process for planning purposes, right? So the tool has a purpose, and at some point you'll find that tool isn't the thing you're going to squeeze more value from. We have actually 20 other frameworks, like I said, for if you want to get to district scale, there's a whole other way to evaluate risk and stress and how that implies itself in the context of a street intersection or of an elder community in a particular neighborhood. So there's lots of tools at our disposal. So those tools are to help us either plan or design what we want to do, and they have a utility, but they're not an end in themselves. The one like STAR, and I was involved, I was the executive director of ICLEI in USA when we created the STAR Community Index, so I'm quite familiar with it. is a rating system to sort of say how you, it's a feedback loop to the people in the city, and it's also a way to do comparability with other cities. So we've not put as much in 100 Resilient Cities emphasis on kind of scoring yourself as resilience. We do have a city resilience index that ARUP developed for us, the same team in ARUP that developed the framework as a lens. There's an index, and there is a pilot going on with a dozen cities or so that are doing that kind of rating, scoring sort of system. And every city has to decide what rating system is feeding back to it the information that it most needs. I think the important thing is, I put it out this way. We're a practice community, part of a bigger movement than any one program or any one rating system. And we have to understand that we're a learning community, and everyone's going to throw up a lot of new things at us. The key thing is to be selective in figuring out where you're at now and the problems you're trying to solve, and how you're going to get from A to B to doing something about it. And then to continue the exchange at that higher level is, how do the STAR people and the USGBC people and the City Resilience Index people have a conversation with one another? And part of what we're doing is we're creating forums for that conversation through funding with the Rockefeller Foundation. So my last comment, we're trying to figure out how one actually puts dollar sign measurement to resilience dividends, so that we can make more of a business case for doing these things. And in that conversation, I'm in direct conversations with the U.S. Green Building Council, with the Urban Land Institute, to really figure out how we can do measurement in a way that gets property developers to think about the value that they could create with dollar signs associated with it if they do build more resilience into their projects. So there is a community of practice there that we're part of, and we're not trying to say ours is better than somebody else's, but we do, because we support this process, and it's been tested out. There are 25 cities that have used it to good outcome. We offer it to you, and if you want to bring STAR into the conversation, it's not incompatible with the conversation we're trying to support here.
Okay, I'm going to go to Chief George.
Thank you. I just wanted to, I think it's important to say I couldn't sit back and not just say I would love to see and would recommend that that you would work with the people from the place, from the land, who have always identified climate and environmental issues from the beginning, has seen it as an issue, and have great things to contribute, and also have time-tested ways of bringing these issues to the forefront, and have always modeled resiliency in the land. And there's another thing that I wanted to talk about.
Good morning, Kate. My name is Buddy Joseph, and formerly worked with Squamish Nation Housing and Capital Projects. Looking at your model there on risks and stresses, I think something that probably could be added is financial risks. I think about what happened in 2008. Decisions made in New York affected the whole world. What can cities do to, investment and growth are important, but to temper it so that we don't put our community members at risk. That event affected our community. We have a department that we partner with corporations, and we're 2 months from signing a major agreement, and it just fell apart. It affected our long-term plan. We still have our plan, but it's not as fast as we had originally planned to move forward with our housing, for example. So is there something that could be done by a city or 100 cities that would be able to help regulate the market? So that's just my thought for the day, and but it did affect us. It still affects us and affected our finances. And I could see that happening with our great city here. And I did notice that Vancouver did put some levies and slow down growth, but I think that's important. It's just my thought. Thank you.
Thanks.
I think that is, first of all, I think it's a great sort of segue into the next set of questions that I have for you, but I also, I think that it's really important as we think about what resilience means for our community, that we're thinking about what it means for every member of our community, and that we're not only contemplating GDP as the number one factor that will contribute to our well-being. And certainly we have a lot to learn from your experience and from the experience of cities around the world that are also grappling with that. So thank you. Nola, Kate, are we okay to transition, or do we
Do you want to go on with your questions? We have until
Yeah.
11 o'clock.
Yeah, so
There are two people.
Okay, we could take 2 more questions. Yeah, sorry, there's 2 more, or 2 or 3.
At
Yeah.
least. So Alexander,
Okay.
you had a question? It was done. Good. Then if you put your card up, I'll come to you in a minute, but I'll go first to Louis over there because you've been waiting a long time.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was just listening over the last couple of days to some of the proceedings from Canada's Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. It's an annual roundtable that's held, once a year. This year was in Halifax. And, I was struck by the absence really of a strong BC presence there. And there didn't seem to be a focus on some of the, the hazard issues we're interested in here, earthquake, wildfire. The primary emphasis seemed to be on flood. So the impression I came away with from listening to those proceedings was that there seems to be, a disconnect between what's happening in British Columbia in this area and what's happening at the federal level. So the question would be, how does this process connect in with, with the federal level in Canada, with the provincial level? How does this conversation come together among the different levels of government?
That's a great question, and as an emergency management practitioner, I have to agree. Over the last several years, there has been a really strong focus, particularly at the national level, on flooding, and there's really good reason for that too. That is probably the number one risk facing the majority of Canadians, or one of the top risks facing the majority of Canadians, particularly in the context of climate change. It's also a risk here in our region. I will say that in the context of the 100 Resilient Cities program, we have monthly Team Canada calls with our colleagues in Montreal, Toronto, and Calgary to talk about how do we advocate for our local issues on a national scale. And Montreal is also a city that has highlighted earthquake risk as one of their biggest challenges. So that's one of the avenues that we're using. And just sitting a few seats down from you, I see Marie Journet, who could probably comment on this much more than I can. But here in Vancouver and in this region, there has been, particularly in the last few years, an extended focus on seismic risk, and there's been growing conversation between provincial and federal governments and local governments. A great example would be the UR Plus Understanding Risk Conference that was held last year as a collaboration between the city, Natural Resources Canada, the province, and a number of other agencies that came together to really talk about seismic risk. So I agree that many of our local challenges are not necessarily reflected on the national stage, but I think that that's changing. And I think that in the context of thinking about resilience is not just about one hazard, it's about being adaptable to change in the future, and that's a conversation that can help us to open the door to being more effective on that national scale. So I hope that helps, and happy to talk to you about it further.
Do you want to take more questions, or do you want to ask your specific questions?
We've got 20 minutes. We can finish if there's 2 more. There's 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap.
Let's, you in the front row, I can't read your name card. Sorry.
Yeah, one of the things that comes to mind from the presentations that were covered here, especially the question, what does 2060 hold? One of the key areas that I seem to identify that people need a lot of support, and a lot of the success of the work that that is affected through the resilience strategy will depend on youth education, behavior change, and long-term inculcation of an attitude of adaptation and resilience. And I was wondering, what are some of the plans, or the maybe with the Team Canada, a Canadian approach to how we put forward a lot of those issues from a very young age among Canadian youth, so that they carry it forward 2060 and beyond?
That's a great question, and I think it's really important, because you're right, why would we create a resilience strategy if it wasn't for the people that are going to have to deal with the impacts? So one of the more exciting conversations that we've been having in the city of Vancouver is with the UN group for the UN Major Group for Children and Youth, and we're working towards a collaboration with that group to try and bring youth voices into this discussion in a really meaningful way. So not just asking what is it that youth are concerned about, but also bringing youth into conversations about seismic risk, about financing, about technology. And so we're in the very early stages of sort of mapping out what that engagement looks like, but I absolutely agree, and would welcome other thoughts and advice on ways to do that.
One more. Can I ask you to hold? No, right here.
Hi, I'm Melody Ma. My question is about culture and resiliency. So how does culture play in to resiliency as a stressor as well as an impact area? So when I say culture, I mean language, heritage, collective memory as a city or a nation. I mean, we're seeing a lot of issues in Europe as well as in the States around culture, especially as a stressor around migration. So how does it play into resiliency?
Do you want me to take that, or do you have some thoughts, Jeb?
Yeah, that's, you're correct to highlight that culture is both an asset and can also be a barrier to resiliency. So one would really have to unpack those things and discuss them separately, but let's speak to the example of Europe. We've worked with some of our platform partners, the International Rescue Committee, and other humanitarian response organizations to hold convenings, particularly for the European cities within our network, about how to integrate the latest waves of refugees from North Africa and the Middle East. In particular, in Greece, one of them was hosted in Athens, and then another one was hosted in Paris, given the issues related to social integration in Paris and that underlying stress within French society, with people from North Africa in particular, to figure out how the municipality can be a more receiving municipality to people of different cultural backgrounds, and to create spaces for those people to interact, and also to think about more fundamental Maslowian needs like housing supply and medical care and things like that. So that aspect of integration has, in particular in European cities, but also in North America as well, especially in the United States, given the politics around immigration in the U.S. right now, has sort of skyrocketed to being a priority issue that the cities are working on together with one another in developing practices of integration and settlement of new peoples and new cultures into society. The other flip side of culture is how is continuing to build on the foundation of one's culture in a positive way as an asset evolve into a resource that is used to inculcate further resilience, and how do cultural amenities and cultural facilities create spaces in which they provide a resilience dividend. So how do they offer a benefit today, but also provide, for instance, a cultural facility, an emergency center in the case of a crisis. And so how do cultural or social facilities serve multiple purposes? So we're really, culture is emerging as a pretty salient theme across the cities that have launched their strategies, and from both perspectives as it is there. And it's definitely highlighted there on the City Resilience Framework as a lens that we ask everyone to think about it whenever they're thinking about a particular shock or stressor.
Yeah, I would just add to that before I wrap up that I think it's a really important question, and that culture is an asset in the context of resilience, not least because it's one of our greatest opportunities to combat some of the challenges that we face, like social isolation. It's also an opportunity to acknowledge, I spoke to what we heard last night, and this feeling among people in the room that we need to spend more time with people who are different and who have different perspectives to offer. And I think that, I've worked in government now for a long time, and institutionally, government isn't great, or it's terrible actually, at acknowledging and bringing in different cultures. And I don't know what the answer is, but I think that there's definitely space through this conversation to ask those tough questions and to think about how we redefine the way that our institutions operate so that they're not exclusive of culture and that they appreciate and value and support culture. So I'm just gonna change gears a little bit. A lot of what we've talked about so far, and a lot of the things that I've heard so far, are issues that people care about now and today. And those are critically important, and we gotta deal with those. But I think that one of the great benefits of having all of you in this room, as people who have been thinking about this for a long time, as people who come with a lived experience yourselves, and as people who are thinking about the future, is the opportunity to sort of pull ourselves a little bit out of this question of what are the shocks and stressors that we're facing, and to think about what are the trends or the issues that are going to affect our city in the future. And so I'm actually just going to give you, I think, like a 1-minute assignment. I'm going to ask you to turn to your neighbor, and in 1 minute, I'm going to ask you to identify from your perspective if there's any other shocks or stresses that you haven't heard about today that you think we need to consider. If there's any trends or issues that will affect the future of our city. And then finally, one factor that will enable us to thrive in a turbulent and uncertain future. You don't have to put a lot of thought into this, whatever comes to the top of your head. Share that information with your neighbor, and then we'll ask a few of you to share with us in order to set us up for the conversation later this afternoon. Go.
Talk.
I know. Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah. I think we'll just do we've got minutes, so however many we've got. Well, I was just gonna say like.
getting the information you need out of this.
Yeah. That's really good. Okay, I'm going to give you 10 more seconds. What's that? Oh, yeah, I thought he was too. Oh, I thought he was doing it for this, yeah. Okay, that's great. Yeah, because we were going to get the factors. Great. All right. It sounds like you're all having really great conversation, and that's awesome. And you're going to be able to continue this over the break and into the afternoon. But I'm just probably going to randomly select. Actually, somebody stand up right now who's really keen to share. Come on, you were all just talking. Go for it. You can sit down. Sorry, I shouldn't have said stand up. That was not very smart.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, great.
So what we were discussing was the fact that as we continue to develop in an urban concept, we tend to be losing the availability of livability space. And so we're constantly building 55, 56, 57-story buildings. But when we do that and we put 2,500 people in them, where do those people interact with the community? Because we're not doing anything to enhance or improve our parks. We're not doing anything to increase or enhance our availability of that world-famous phrase that we have, well, we can, when you live in Vancouver, you can go golfing in the morning, go swimming in the afternoon, and go skiing in the evening. You have to have access in order to be able to do that. And I think we're getting too intent on developing vertically, and we're becoming laterally challenged. So, thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Hi. So we discussed a couple of key points about war and conflict. That wasn't mentioned by the panel, so that's one thing. Also, the political instability, especially of the U.S. right now. Another thing connecting to war and conflict is North Korea. So nobody's touched on that, and because if they don't hit the U.S., they're going to hit us probably. So that's another thing that probably should be discussed. Is there anything else? Yeah.
Yeah, she's just asked me anything else, so maybe I'll chime in. I was at a movie a couple of days ago called Invisible Cities. It was about a big camp in Kenya, and there's hundreds of thousands of people in this camp. They're coming from Somalia, Sudan, but there's a panel following the movie, and the panel was a really diverse group of people. There was a professor in African studies. There was someone who'd lived in the camp, now is a student at Simon Fraser University. There was a UN Habitat person who'd worked in the camps. But the interesting thing about that group of people was just the diversity of opinions, and it kind of just brought to mind the need for diversity of input in this discussion. If the group is too homogenous, it doesn't really put a light on the cracks and the fissures, because I think in this discussion there's a lot of political divisions. I think there's a lot of room for potential conflict as this discussion moves forward. Anyway, that was kind of my just thinking, responding to your question and thinking about the movie. That was what came to mind.
Thank you. And just so you know, I'm not going to respond to these because I want to get through as many as we can, but we're writing them down. Yeah.
One of the things that I feel like we haven't been talking about, and we can't talk about resiliency without talking about biodiversity loss. And I know that cities typically are built on a gray environment, but how do we make sure that the green environment is represented in cities as key drivers through food systems to biodiversity loss is something that I think is really important to these discussions.
Absolutely. Thank you. Christine?
Environmental refugees. I'd really like us, especially as community planners, to discuss more about creating policy and framework for when folks do start to arrive. Canada has a great reputation. We have a load of space. This would be a logical place for our global collective to convene here, but people come so stressed out. PTSD, so can we not get a framework together so that when they arrive, we know where the language and cultural nodes are, so that we can say, hey, so these are your options. We're there to support so that we're taking care of one another. So that's my big one. And of course, Stephen's was transportation. He's with BEST.
Thank you. Over here, yeah, I think.
I think one of the biggest stressors is public apathy. I mean, everybody here is really committed. We're going to have great ideas. What's the turnout rate in a municipal election? 20%? 30%? What you get is we've got to be able to move this into the public sphere, because the only time people get engaged is when they vote down bond issues, they vote down transit levies. And so all this stuff is, you've got to be able to engage a greater population. There are a variety of people that if they came here today said, this is great, but I'm worried about putting food on the table. I got a kid to get to school tomorrow. Those are the things that affect, and we have to somehow translate this 30,000 foot look into something that people will vote for. Because at the end of the day, politicians are the ones making the decisions. They respond to voters, and we've seen the example, HST, we've seen the example with transit levies. For those of you old enough can remember George Puel got run out of office for suggesting a $70 a transit levy, which would have funded our transit. So these are things that we've got to be able to translate what we're doing today and sell it to the public. It's easy to sell it in this room, but you've got to move it out into the people that vote and affect that.
Thank you. There's a few more right beside you, so we'll take that group.
Okay. We talked a little bit, actually following on that point, but maybe a slightly different perspective. We talked about the trend of looking at our political system a little bit differently. There's, talk about proportional representation, and, in 40 years, we're probably going to continue and evolve that idea. And I think the other trend to think about is that I think in our generation, there's less and less trust in institutions. There's less trust in what government is telling people. There's social media. People can get information from a lot of places. And I think there's also a movement to people believe that they are empowered to make decisions. So not necessarily just politicians that would make decisions, but the civil society and building that civil society. So people are participating and are encouraged and engaging in that in those discussions. And I think the other piece is also on what is the investment, not just in government, but in your collaborators, which to me is actually the third sector, the nonprofit sector. And I think both of the speakers mentioned about the importance of communities and how they were the ones that were in an emergency situation, were the people on the ground. They probably are the ones that are going to know who's going to be in what house and why haven't you've seen them at the muster station. Not necessarily the fire chief or other folks that might actually know that. So how can we invest in that, the nonprofit sector, community groups that are really building communities and can actually be, in the face of emergencies, can be very resilient.
Yeah, I agree. We've got about a minute left. I'm going to do a quick fire round, as many as we can get around. We'll start up in this corner.
Great, thanks. We talked about, at a larger conceptual level, the absence of language about social justice and environmental justice to this issue, that for currently marginalized communities, resiliency means material redistribution and concrete resources that equip them to better cope with disaster, and that after disaster, there needs to be discussion of how preventing exploitation by capital of that disaster and the consequent resulting further stratification and issues of injustice.
Thank you, well said. On the corner here.
Yeah, we're asking, about three other different shocks and stresses to consider. And Marta and I were just discussing how the the electoral system is a shock and a stress potentially, and the unpredictability of elections in a democracy. And we only have to look to the country to our immediate south to see the enormous shock that recent presidential election has created to all kinds of systems. So I think the idea about short election cycles versus long-term issues and trends and how you reconcile those two, and how do you anticipate and then plan for addressing changes to things that you thought had been solved through previous administrations, for example. So I think that's an important piece to think about.
I haven't heard that articulated that way yet, so thank you. Last one, okay. Up in the, yeah.
What's been the shock of success? What's worked so well, it was unexpected. I don't know, maybe solar technology, something like that. But I get where the downers come from. It's easy to get into the apocalyptic scenario, real easy. Yeah. So just as a palate cleanser, how do you remind yourself of what is working? And may I just push back, as an example, on something that was said earlier. The government isn't very good at bringing other cultures in. I think it's actually pretty good. That's the place where the policies and the workforce and the discussion occurs. This is actually not too bad an example, but yeah, no, we've been actually pretty good at this. So it helps to acknowledge that occasionally and to focus on that, which I think Jeb was touching on. Okay, what's working out there that's really practical and surprisingly so?
Thank you for that. I definitely agree, and in this conversation of resilience, it is very hard to lift out of the doomsday, but there is a lot of amazing things happening within our city, within our country, and those are the things that we also need to build in on.